this is the second part of my EverQuest Cleric lineup. You know, not so much the setup, but just talking about the spells and kind of my ideas and what we can do with this. In this one, I'm going to focus mainly on the Undead lineup because that's what I'm working on here. And the synergies, how we can bring the best results from taking advantage of the various synergies that are available. Contraventions and interventions, those are your heal, nuke, and nuke heal spells. And auras, like Purified Ground is one you don't bring into very much, but it's kind of interesting. And then the Vise and some of the other alternatives. So let's start with this chart I put together. It's a big one. This is a run-through of the Restless Assault mission, killing the bulk of the trash. I don't know if this incorporates all of that, but it's all undead mobs. And in this particular case, I was able to get about 105,000 DPS for each of these mobs, which was a very good result, better than I usually do. And I don't have... This guy, he's in group gear, mostly a mix between TOV Tier 2 and COV Tier 1, and starting to replace and upgrade to the COV Tier 2. He does not have all of the AAs, but he has the bulk of the relevant AAs now. He doesn't have his like Earthquake. There's a couple focus lines that would add a little extra damage, but he's got most of them done. And then I have this chart, if you look down here, and it'll show you all of the things that go into my Cleric putting together that 105,000 DPS against undead mobs. The two main nukes I use against undead are Obliterate the Undead and Repudiate the Undead. These are great nukes, and some people have questioned them, but what's important isn't just the Obliterate the Undead, Repudiate the Undead. And if you look, it says 25,000 DPS for Obliterate the Undead and 15,600 DPS for Repudiate the Undead. Depending on your setup and what you're doing, you'll be lower than that, but they'll usually be your top nukes. What makes them even more important is they have a 24% chance of proccing destruction. So Obliterate destruction and Repudiate destruction. You can't, if you are casting Obliterate Undead and Repudiate Undead, if Obliterate destruction procs, it's going to be on for 12 seconds, and it will block Repudiate destruction. That won't stick. But since they're each 24% chance, I think you'll see that over time, both of them end up sticking. So Obliterate the Undead is 25,000 DPS, but it's also Obliterate Destruction with procs. There's another 5,000 DPS. Repudiate the Undead does 15,000 DPS. Repudiate Destruction, there's another 4,000 DPS. So that's one of the reasons these are good. They're also minus 100 to resist. So they're going to stick on almost all of your undead. They're fast. They regenerate reasonably quickly. Now, I said these are your first two nukes. Obliterate the Undead and Repudiate the Undead. That's your 115 nuke and your 110 nuke. And I have the Type 3 focus for both of those. Now, for the third nuke, because these don't cycle fast enough to be their own, to be the only two spells that you need a third one. And there's 3 or 4 choices. And to be honest, they're all about the same. One is you can memorize the 105 Undead nuke. Even get the Type 3 AUG if you want. You're going to have to make that decision. The 105 does significantly less damage than the 115 and 110 Undead nukes. And but it does, and the fact that that third destruction line isn't gonna stick if you've got the first and the second on. So I find the third one, it does about the same damage as your other choices, but I have chosen not to go with that. The next choice is the one that I go with, which is Unyielding Sensor. That is your twin cast nuke. It does fairly decent damage. In this case, 9457 DPS for my Cleric. Average hit of about 195,000 because you're critting a lot on this stuff. And it's your twin cast nuke. So anytime you're going to be able to cast heals, it'll twin cast those heals. I find it probably gives me my highest DPS alternative. Now, the truth is that Obliterate Undead and Repudiate Undead and Unyielding Sensor will occasionally, I think that's not quite a complete lineup, because when you finish with Unyielding Sensor, Obliterate will still, just for a second or two, be down. But because Obliterate is your highest DPS nuke, it doesn't really hurt your DPS. I think it's worth waiting that 1 or 2 seconds occasionally to recast Obliterate the Undead. And a lot of times you're going to be in between casting heals and different things. So I'm happy with that. For a while, I did the Judgment line. I added that as a fourth nuke. I found that it wasn't as high. You know, you're nuking constantly. You always have one up that way. But because you would obliterate less, and that means you have less of proccing Obliterate Destruction. So for me, I like against Undead, Obliterate Undead, Repudiate Undead, and Unyielding Sensor. Those are my primary nukes. What else do I have here? Evoker Synergy. That averages out at about 14,000 DPS. For me, in this particular case, that comes from having a wizard in the group and his synergy. So, like the Bard synergy does 135,000 points of damage. Evoker Synergy does 90,000 points of damage. And it adds a nice chunk of DPS. I like that. And it triggers off of basically your magic line is what you'll be having memmed in this case. Now, I mentioned there's other alternatives besides Unyielding Sensor. If you're coming against really resisty mobs, Chroma Strike is kind of an interesting choice. It's your lowest, it's chromatic, so it's going to go against whatever their lowest resist is. So the fact is it just sticks a lot more often. And I find that even though it's your lowest nuke, it tends to do about the same DPS against a lot of mobs as some of your higher nukes like Unyielding Sensor or Judgment. So that's a possibility. What I have is a tab where I put my resists, and every now and then I check my resists. If you're getting lots of resists, you might consider going with Chroma Strike. Because even though Unyielding Sensor gives you that twin heal, the fact is you probably don't need that twin heal too much. So that's your Evoker Synergy. Then we drop down here. Turn Undead is your AA. You want to use that whenever it's up. What I would say is this: against any mob that still has a significant, like 80% of its hit points, because it has an initial strike, Turn Undead Strike here, which is doing about 6,500 DPS over the course of the entire run. But it also has a dot, a Turn Undead dot, which up here is 2747 DPS, 552,000 is a max tick, average tick of 319,000. It's a nice, big, juicy dot that you get from this AA. So you want to get the most out of it. So you want to hit it early when there's a lot of health in the mob. There's another possibility. Now, in these runs, I'm killing the mobs in under 20 seconds. In some case, under 16 seconds. They're dying fast. There is an undead dot. If you're in a situation where the mobs are living for a minute or maybe even 45 seconds or so, then instead of Unyielding Sensor, you might hit them with your undead dot. Or you might hit them with your undead dot and then go into your rotation with whatever 3 nukes you're using. So the undead dot is useful, but it's just not going to do... If you're killing mobs really fast, not useful. Turn undead, always useful. Hit that at the beginning, whatever your highest. It's really high DPS. Then we have Composite Reinforced Strike, Mana Replication, which comes from the Enchanter. And Mana Replication is interesting because it has Mana Replication Strike 2, 5200. And then it kind of re-replication and Replication Strike 3 and re-replication 3. And, it goes lower and lower. But so this is the Mana Replication. It's one of the auras that an enchanter uses. And it turns out to be kind of a nice chunk of DPS. Not sure. The Composite Reinforced Strike, I think, comes from the Bard. Obliterate Destruction, Repudiate Destruction we mentioned. Okay, here's an interesting one. This is Arms of Holy Wrath 6. This is when you are doing direct nukes, it has a chance to proc this. I'm not doing melee in here, and I'll tell you why in a second. But it ends up, there's another 4,000 DPS as your to the mix. So this is just for using I use the two-handed COV2 weapon. And that procs Arms of Holy Wrath 6. It will also proc a different proc if you are meleeing. Now, I don't melee when I'm doing my undead line. And it has to do with the fact that, okay, Shadow Knight, they're meleeing and they're casting taps and nukes and dots. They're instant spells, so they go off while you continue to melee. But with the Cleric spells, which are going off at a second and a half or so to 3 seconds, while you're casting, your melee stops. While you're meleeing, you're not going to be getting the benefit of casting, for instance. I do melee, but that's in my live setup, which is a different setup that I use to try and eke out as much damage as I can against live mobs. I do about 60%, 50 to 60% of the damage against live mobs that I do against undead mobs. Arcane Symphony Effect. This is one of the Bard songs. You can see that that's bringing another 1,500 to the table. And in this case, this Bard is not using insults very much, which is unfortunate because those insults would be another nice source of damage. They do probably be even better than the Evoker Synergy, especially if he's casting multiple insults. Infusion of Holy Light is a proc that comes along with the turn Undead Strike. It can proc Infusion of Holy Light, which can be like a $1.2 million strike. Bane Strike. And then the Vicious Rabbit. I have him. This isn't his damage. This is just you get when you cast it, you get 1 hit point of damage. But they do, you'll have to do check it yourself on a dummy or something or a mob. But I've gotten anywhere from 12,000 to 20,000 DPS for the brief period that Vicious Rabbit's up. And when you're a Cleric trying to eke out every bit of damage that you can do, that Vicious Rabbit is a nice little extra to throw in there. But you can see this is all coming together. Now let's go back and talk a little more at synergies. This is the Wizard Synergy I mentioned. Great extra DPS. And it procs over just about any of your spells. Any non-fire direct spell. So any nuke that you do is going to trigger that synergy strike. Troubadour Synergy, any melee attack or direct damage spell is going to trigger that synergy. So you don't have to even think about it. Your but it's one reason why you don't want to just heal. You want to be nuking also, because these synergies are going to be triggered and they can add up. Another synergy is the Beguiler Synergy. Fire, ice, or magic. Well, your undead are magic and your unyielding sensor are magic. So most any lineup you have, you will have a magic nuke loaded. Gifted Chromatic Haze. Again, that's going to be triggered by just about any spell you cast. Elemental Flames is going to be triggered by just about any spell you cast. You don't have to think about it. Conjure Synergy. Okay, here's the exception. That is only going to be triggered by a fire, which you don't have, or a chromatic spell that deals at least 100 damage. And it'll increase the damage by 75%. The only chromatic spell you have is Chroma Strike. That happens to be also your lowest damage spell. So even with Conjure Synergy, I find that Unyielding Sensor tends to do more damage. Conjure Synergy is great for an enchanter, for instance, which has chromatic spells that do a lot of damage. Conjure Synergy is weak for a cleric, and I don't suggest memorizing a chromatic spell just to trigger Conjure Synergy if you have a mage. There's other things that you can be using that are probably more useful. But these are your synergies. You don't have to think about them. You just have to make sure that your lineup has something that will trigger them. And you will just trigger them, and it starts throwing in all sorts of different damage. Again, the bard did not do insults. That's because he was being boxed. So let's, it was just a basic lineup. That's no biggie there. Never triggered the Conjure Synergy because I did not have Chroma Strike memmed. But I did trigger Beguiler Synergy, Evoker Synergy. Beguiler Synergy isn't going to show up here because it just increases the damage of the base damage of the spell. So it just means you will do more damage, but there's no specific sign that you got the synergy. Whereas the Evoker is a separate Synergy Strike. It doesn't increase the damage of the spell that triggers it. It has its own separate strike. And Troubadour Synergy does not show up as easy too because it increases the damage of that direct damage spell. Okay, so I said I was going to talk about the DPS. This is, again, my undead lineup. Things that I also use in the undead lineup at different times. If I'm not going to be mezzing the 115 or 114 AoE Earthquake spell, that does some nice significant damage even without the AAs for that, and I don't think I have the AAs for that done yet. Especially if you're pulling 5, 6, 7, 8 mobs at once. A lot of times I'll pair it with Silent Strike, which is a stun for up to 3 seconds. And I like to use that when the mobs are first pulled in. You've got 7 or 8 mobs coming in. You hit them with Silent Strike. They're all stunned for 3 seconds. It gives you a chance to get control of the situation. It gives the tank a chance to get control of the situation. If there's, that's what's going on there. And it also does some damage. In this case, I didn't use any AoEs because we were mezzing the mobs. Purified Ground. Okay, there's a couple of auras that you can use. And one is Aura of the Reverent. Okay, obviously, when you pick auras, the first one you're going to want to use is the one that increases hit points. It does a great job. It's nice, extra hit points. You're going to love it. Everybody wants that. It's helpful. The second one you often use is Aura of the Reverend, which gives you like a 4% damage shield. It absorbs 4% of the damage, but it does not stack with Shining Aegis or Protection of Eye. Shining and Protection both give you 10%. Protection of Vi is the group buff, and it has a cap on how much damage it will absorb, where Shining, as long as it's up, it'll be absorbing 10%. Shining is well worth casting on your main tank. Protection of Vi is nice to cast on your group. Aura of the Reverent, use it if you're not going to be using Purified Ground. Purified Ground is a unique little aura that is akin to the Necro Blight Sphere, because it will damage every undead that steps into the aura, and the aura has a chance of rooting them. When you're pulling lots of undead at once, this Purified Ground aura is nice. It adds up. And, you know, it's every certain number of seconds, it'll do more damage. It's not an aura that moves with you, so what I'm going to suggest is that you use it mostly if you're at a static camp pulling to a static camp. If you're moving camp, you're going to want to reach up and click off. You're going to hit Shift A, pull up your auras, and click off Purified Ground anytime you move, and then just recast it every time you come to your next area where you've got 3 or more mobs. So that's your auras: Purified Ground, your hit point aura, and the aura of the Reverend. You could have 2 auras up at once. Generally, if you're not doing undead, that's going to be the hit point aura and aura of the Reverend. If you are going against undead, then you might consider memorizing Purified Ground and recasting that as needed. It's a little extra DPS. You're going to have to figure out your spell slots, because, you know, you'll run out. So let's talk here. Shining Aegis, particular aura, I've done that. Mark. Okay. Synergies and Contraventions. You can get type 3s for those. You can also focus those so they do more damage. They're actually very hard-hitting nukes. The interventions are you target your tank or whoever you're healing, you cast it, and then whoever they're hitting is going to be nuked. And it's a fairly hard-hitting nuke, but it's got a 30-second recycle time. If you're going to use the interventions, you would use your 115 and 110, or 114 and 130, whatever it works out. Those two top interventions. The third just doesn't do enough for me, to my mind, to make it worthwhile. And you're probably going to want to, because those interventions only recycle every 30 seconds, they're best used as a heal. You know, hit it when you need to heal the tank. And here's the trick to that. This is a really cool trick with interventions that works with interventions but not contraventions. If you have used your Unyielding Sensor, which is your twin cast nuke, then that intervention not only doubles the heal, it twin casts the heal, it also twin casts the nuke. So you're going to double the nuke of your interventions. That does not work on contravention, but whether it's a bug or a feature, if you have hit Unyielding Sensor, there's going to put a buff up on you, on your song window, and it's going to have 2 charges of twin cast and heal. And if you then use an intervention on your tank, it will twin cast the heal, and it will twin cast the nuke portion. Contraventions are the ones where you target the mob, and then it heals the mob that it has targeted. And it hits just as hard as the interventions, but you can't double it with that twin cast Unyielding Sensor. You can double it with improved twin cast, you know, and there's your chance of getting twin casts. Contraventions versus interventions. Obviously, interventions do a little more damage because of the twin cast effect if you're doing it right. But it also means you're constantly going to be targeting the mob and then targeting your tank. So if you have a style where you prefer to be targeting the tank and healing, then interventions are nice. If you have a style where you like to be hitting the mob and using your, whatever nukes you've come up with, if it's undead, obliterate the undead, repudiate the undead, and then you can also do your contraventions, then you might memorize a couple of those. You're going to have to figure out how many slots you can devote to heals, how many slots you need to devote to nukes, and then how much for extra. I said I was going to cover Mark versus Retort. Mark is the damage shield that you target the mob and you hit it with Mark, and then it means that every time it hits your tank or a group member is going to do damage to itself, and anytime anybody hits the mob, they're going to get a heal. Retort does the exact same mark, essentially. It puts a buff on your tank or whoever you target it, and then it marks the tank, the target of the tank. They don't stack, so pick one or pick the other. Retort generally is your better choice, but there are times when mark makes more sense because of the way, for instance, if you are targeting the mobs when they're fighting you, Retort doesn't work. Because you target yourself, Retort would not mark the mob. You would want to use mark. I use mark for longer fights. For short fights, not so much. And the heal benefit is nice, but you've got so many heals going on already from, your elixir, or your abundant healing, or, any of the other. You just healing. And you can also occasionally, do a group heal, whatever. So I find that those heals don't matter so much. Clerics are already way over the top when it comes to healing. Longer fights, you're going to use more of the kind of special cleric things. And I think when I'm coming to the next section of this video, I'm going to go in how I handle live mob interactions. And I start to bring in more of that just because I don't have as many. I'm more of a battle cleric mode when I'm going against live mobs. I am in there. I am hitting and mixing up and meleeing as well as doing nukes because I don't have super great nukes to use like I do against undead. So that's Synergy, Interventions, Contraventions, Purified Grounds, Mark versus Retort, Shiny Aegis and Protection of Eye, or the Reverent. There is going to be a part 3. Part 3 I will deal with live mobs, my battle cleric strategy, and maybe even get into some more solo strategies. I'm going to end this now because we've gone on quite a while.